Okay, welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm here with Jeff Wald. He is the author of The End of Jobs. He's a successful entrepreneur, founder of WorkMarket, a former reservist police officer. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Well, we will dive into the book, but I do find it's an interesting, an interesting journey you've been through. So you were at NYPD officer for a while in this journey to become an entrepreneur and now author.
Well, I will say this. I mean, I started my career as an M&A banker with JP Morgan, went off to business school. And then when I got back, in business school was the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And one of the many benefits of business school is you meet all these people from different walks of life. There were a lot of military people at my school. And I said to them, I'm joining up the military. They're like, no. Let us fight the fight. Your place is in the private sector. You keep the economy strong. We'll do the fighting. And, I didn't really love that answer, but I appreciated that maybe my skill set was better in the private sector, certainly than theirs, because these were unbelievably impressive men and women. But when I got back to New York City, I'd learned that there was a program within the NYPD called the Auxiliary Units, and that allowed me to serve, in a sense, certainly my community, my city, and in a very small sense, my country, but not derail my career. And so while I was building WorkMarket, while I was building my startups that I did before WorkMarket, I spent the better part of 10 years as a reserve or auxiliary or volunteer officer within the NYPD. And it was an amazing experience. And I'm so glad that I got a chance to serve in some capacity.
Wow. That's impressive that you made space for that. Yes, because building startups is, it's not like a 9 to 5.
It is not a 9 to 5. It is. And I remember I don't remember what day it was. Someday I was sitting there and I was directing traffic. There was some huge thing and, whatever. And like 4 of the engineers from WorkMarket came walking by and they were trying to cross the street. And I'm like, stay there. And I didn't know who they were. And I'm like, I was directing traffic and they were trying to cross the street when they shouldn't have. And they kind of were all staring. And I'm like, oh, and I went to signal that they could start walking. And they're like, Jeff? I was like, we'll talk about it on Monday. Let's go. Move it across.
I love it. Wow. Yeah. And what was your number one learning from your time marshalling traffic and presumably other activities?
I did write an article some time ago for the Huffington Post about what I learned at the NYPD and how it applies to startups. But the number one thing is to ask for help. An officer will tell you the most powerful weapon they have on them is their radio.
Right.
That they can inform Central Command and other officers will get there ASAP. And so the idea within a startup that you don't have an equivalent of a radio to ask your investors, your advisors, your friends, your customers, your team for help, the idea that as a founder you have to sit there by yourself and try to power through is ridiculous. There are plenty of people that are willing to help, but you have to pick up the radio and ask.
Right. Yeah. Because I know a lot of people who've been in that. A lot of people kind of get burned out by those roles, right, when they're leading companies. I guess they take it all on themselves, right?
Very true. I will tell you one of my favorite things about serving was getting to spend time with people that were outside of the WorkMarket sphere. Because when I was WorkMarket, right, it was 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're just going. When you finally have a chance to breathe, you need to take a nap and go to the gym for the first time in a month. But then having this social outlet for people that are just thinking about things entirely differently. And that was a wonderful experience. I still remain close with a number of people that I had the pleasure of serving with.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about WorkMarket. So what was the genesis of that, idea and, a little bit of the story of building it?
So, I will say this. When I was a venture capitalist, which is the stop I had before I started some companies, I remember I would sit with founding teams and I would hold up their business plan and say, the only thing I know for 100% certainty is it ain't going down like this. This plan is wrong. I don't know how it's wrong. I certainly don't know how to fix it. All I can do is hope that you're going after a big enough market. And more importantly, I can bet on you and your ability to adjust. And so with WorkMarket, I had spent the better part of 2 years working with my co-founder thinking about this business. What would we do? What would it look like? How would we approach it? And we knew we were going after a very big market. There was a study by McKinsey in 07, 08 that talked about that there was 1 trillion in on-demand spend in the world at that point. But if companies had the systems and processes to manage on-demand labor at scale, that 1 trillion would go to 3 to 4 trillion. And I thought, well, that's a move you want to power. Like I want to be on that train. And this goes all the way back to business school. Actually, I remember reading a paper called "The Nature of the Firm" by Professor Ronald Coase,
Yeah,
Nobel
I'm
Prize
familiar
winner.
with it. Yeah.
And in it, his conclusions were a corporation's better off being a large fixed cost entity because the transaction costs and the friction of engaging people on demand was too high. I remember thinking, okay, well, I'm sure that was true in 1937. I doubt it's true now. And so I engaged some advisors at the university, and I began a process of rewriting that paper. The Nature of the Firm Revisited. Did not complete that. That was way too hard. I decided, you know what, I'm just going to get drunk a lot at school. That's crazy. I'm not doing that. So I binned that, but I always had in my mind, wouldn't mobile technology and search technology and digital work and all these other things massively reduce those transaction costs? Of course they had, but if they reduced them enough that corporations were better off in a more flexible or agile construct. And I think that the modern work environment would tell us the answer to that is yes in some areas, and clearly still no in others. So I remember thinking, all right, well, we need to put this to work, because if we can harness this notion of the Agile corporation, building on Professor Coase's work, if we can harness what the data McKinsey was putting forward in terms of the size of the potential market, can we build the tools that allow the buyer of labor and the seller of labor to connect directly? And the answer was we could, but it was much more difficult than we thought. The idea of connecting a corporation to an individual that wants to work is filled with a host of challenges that we didn't really appreciate or understand. And it took us, about $100 million to overcome before we finally were able to get it right, which I feel very confident that we did. And ADP, who ended up purchasing WorkMarket, also felt very confident that we got it right.
Right. $100 million. Wow.
Yeah.
It's a complex problem.
Look, it is a very complex problem. When I tell people that are going after the gig market, and I have the pleasure of advising a lot of companies in the space and investing in a number, I'm like, this is much more complicated than you think. This is not a consumer interaction where one person can just connect with another. So all you need is a means for them to connect, a means for them to engage, a means for them to pay each other, a means for them to communicate, a means for them to rate. When you're dealing with corporations, you need to worry about procurement and HR and legal and the regulatory environment. And you need to set up all kinds of controls and data privacy and things like that you just aren't your prime concern when you're just connecting a consumer to a consumer.
Right. Right. And what were the areas of work that you focused on? Like, presumably you niched in a little bit.
We always built the platform to be industry agnostic, to say we will work with any industry, no issues. That said, one of the biggest mistakes we made, and I always think about the mistakes we made because at some point I'll build another company. But one of the biggest mistakes we made at WorkMarket is we didn't really have a marketplace full of people. And if you're going to connect companies to individual workers, the number one problem all companies have is they need more people. We thought the number one problem that they had was efficiency, and the number two problem was compliance. And in some companies, those were flipped. And those were big problems. They were number two or three, but they were actually much further down. And we never really solved number one. So I say all this to say we started in the IT services industry because my co-founder and I had relationships in that space. We knew the space. We knew how the IT service workflow worked. And we had a lot of people that we could put into the marketplace just from our experiences. As we tried to move into other industries, it became challenging to move into those industries. We didn't have the efficiency and the compliance stuff nailed in those industries. And so there were tweaks that always had to be done. But more importantly is we didn't have the people. And we never fixed this mistake. It was always in our mind, phase two. Phase two, phase one, we'll build all the enterprise tools. Phase two, we're going to build a marketplace. And we just never got there.
Right. In those other markets.
In those other markets, I would
right.
even say in IT services, we had a good marketplace. We didn't have a great one. And I would always go into meetings and say, hey, this is WorkMarket. And they're like, okay, how many plumbers do you have in Cleveland? And I would say, whoa. Don't worry about plumbers in Cleveland. I'm not here to talk to you about plumbers in Cleveland. I'm here to talk to you about efficiency and compliance. And we'd spend an hour going through our song and dance and how that worked and the tools we had. And at the end of the meeting, they'd say, this is amazing. I can see how your software is going to bring organization to the chaos we have engaging our freelance workforce now. This is going to be so helpful. But before you go, I have one last question. How many plumbers do you have in Cleveland, though? Because what I really need is plumbers in Cleveland. And here's the thing, man. After 5 times hearing that, who's the dumb person in the room? It's me. I should have solved the first problem he asked me about, and then the last problem he asked me about, which was plumbers in Cleveland. Because I would always tell people, even though we have a large IT services marketplace, don't assume that you will find a single person with the skills you want, in the geography that you want, with the availability that you want. You need to build your own bench, and we give you the tools to do that. But people always just thought, no, I'll find people in the marketplace. And when they didn't, they would get very upset.
Right. But obviously you found, companies bought your software, so there was enough value in just those problems you were solving that they lived with the fact you didn't have the people. Is that how it played out?
It is very true. Look, we had thousands of companies, still have thousands of companies that utilize the WorkMarket software. And we've done very, very well. And we had a wonderful exit to our friends at ADP. But I juxtapose that with our friends at Fiverr and Upwork that are doing hundreds of millions in revenue. I don't know what ADP has said publicly about WorkMarket and what it does now, but Upwork does more.
Right.
And it's valued, and certainly a IPO at a much higher valuation than we did. And so, look, I am not saying this is a lament.
First world problem, as you might say.
Yeah, we did wonderfully. Our investors made money. My team made money. It was great. But I do think about the suboptimal points because, again, as somebody that's going to go do it again, I need to think about where did I make mistakes and learn from them as I think about startup number 5.
Right. Well, I must say you're sort of modeling that, it's a bit of a cliche now, modeling leadership behavior, but the fact you've been immediately so upfront about, where you made mistakes, that's refreshing from someone in, your position.
Oh, I could write article after article on the number of mistakes we made. And I keep meaning to do it. Like, here are the top 5 mistakes. I think I'm kind of waiting for my final payments from ADP to come through to make sure that they don't get upset, because any mistake I made, they bought. So I'm not sure that they're going to love that. So I'm gonna incubate this for a while, and then I will be a little bit more forthcoming. But I certainly am whenever I speak with people.
Right. So there's WorkMarket, and now let's come to the book, End of Jobs. So why then decide to write a book, and this book in particular?
Well, I'll tell you this. This book was born out of annoyance and frustration, which I think was how a lot of things kind of start germinating. Look, I had the opportunity to speak at a lot of conferences because I was a founder of WorkMarket, and we had built this incredible piece of software, and it was helping companies to transform their labor. But I'd be at these conferences and I'd hear other people talk, either on the panel with me or before me or after me, and I'd think to myself, what the heck is this person saying? That's ridiculous. That's not even remotely accurate. Like, how are they up there spouting us off? And it would annoy me because I am a very data-driven person. I'm a very evidence-driven person. And every time that I'd be on panels and somebody would say something, oh, that's really interesting. What data do you have to support that point of view? So, I didn't. Well, I don't have any. I'm like, okay, well then maybe, and this is the part I wouldn't say. I'm like, well then maybe you should shut up. And just as an evidence, by the way, I was on a panel just the other week, just a few weeks ago. And somebody said, I think half the US workforce, 50% is going to work remotely in the post-pandemic world. I was like, that's really interesting. How do you juxtapose that with the fact that only 42% of the US workforce can work remotely? because clearly people in manufacturing and logistics and entertainment and transportation and a host of other industries can't. He said, oh, I didn't know that only 42% of. I was like, oh, but shouldn't you know that? Shouldn't you know that that's what can happen in the U.S. economy? So things like that I find very frustrating. So I started the book in the on-demand world because that was the world we knew. And everyone kept saying, oh, 50% of the workforce is going to be on demand by 2020. I was like, no, it's not even remotely close. And so I started to put down on paper why that was never going to happen, what it was that actually drove the on-demand economy, and what are the big impediments to on-demand growing much greater, quite frankly, than 35% of the labor force. Like, in my opinion, it will never get higher than that. And that slowly morphed over the years, and I mean years. It took me 7 years to write this book, into, well, if we're going to look at the on-demand economy, we should look at the labor force writ large. And so the way I started to view the issue, if you will, is we need to look at history, we need to look at data, we need to think about how companies actually engage workers. And if we look through those lenses, and then we start to predict what may happen in the world of work. I'm not saying I'm going to be correct. I'm saying we have a higher probability of being correct because the future is the future. I mean, there are all kinds of variables out there in the data that we are not appreciating, and there are technologies and all kinds of things that will change, behavioral changes, societal changes. So very difficult to predict 5 years out, even more difficult 20, 40, forget about it. But we can at least have a higher degree of veracity, and we can at least substantiate our predictions.
Right. And so they break down like the key, predictions that you're making in terms of what's going to happen.
Well, I'll expand the question to say the key takeaways. The first is, this stuff is really complicated, and anytime there's somebody out there peddling some sort of simple solution, I'm not saying that they're always going to be wrong. That's not, who am I? What do I know? I would say, ask them what their evidence is. What is the data they're using to make that prediction? Because simplistic conclusions are usually incorrect. We can talk through some very real world examples on that. 2 is, you can't paint anything in the labor world with a broad brush. You need to look industry by industry, job function by job function, in a lot of cases company by company, to really understand what's happening and how a new technology, a new process may impact the labor force. So those aside, some of the bigger predictions are there will be no net job losses from the robots and AI. This is very different than the zeitgeist of, 50% of jobs are going to go. For some reason, everyone loves that 50% number. We note that. I don't know why. Just, it's half, easy. So no net job losses to robots and AI, but we will have 10 to 15% of jobs lost. We'll just create more jobs. The big challenge that we will face as a society is retraining workers from the industries and functions that are dying, moving them into the industries and functions that are growing. And so the next is that the on-demand economy, while it is a very important part of the labor force, and it is large and it is growing, it is not the future of work, certainly not in the way people think. And the last kind of big takeaway or conclusion is one that I've kind of tweaked since the pandemic, because clearly when new data comes in, we should be agile ourselves and change our predictions. And that's the remote workforce will make up about 8% of the US workforce. Again, remembering 42% is our natural limit, but the flexible workforce is going to be about 32, 33%. Flexible meaning less than 50% of the time you are outside of the office. So you're still going 3 days a week, but you will no longer have to kind of go into this 9 to 5, 5 days a week construct. You'll be able to be more flexible with your schedule. And that, by the way, was the point of the title of the book, The End of Jobs. It was not the end of jobs because technology and robots are taking our jobs. It was the end of this 9 to 5, one office, one manager job, moving to this fluid, team-based, work from anywhere, always on job. And that is certainly something that the pandemic has sped up.
Right. That's interesting, because so what's surprising me there, 8%, that's a very small number, right? 8%, given how many people are working remotely right now, that's really interesting.
True. Well, look, we should start with history and data. Pre-pandemic in the U.S., and most of my research is U.S. focused, although very applicable to anything in the any country in the OECD, so any industrialized country. Pre-pandemic, 3% of the workforce work remotely, and definitions are important here. Remote means more than 50% of the time you are not in the office. So if you go to the office 3 days a week, and you're remote 2 days of the week, you are not considered a remote worker. You're considered as someone with a flexible work arrangement. And the 50% is very important because not only does it drive the infrastructure discussion at a company, do I need to give this person a permanent desk or can they hotel or hot desk? But it also has very important implications from a tax nexus standpoint as to where you're being taxed. So there's one area where 50% is very important as opposed to our prediction markets where they're not very important. So we started at 3% when we came into the pandemic. And the 10 years prior, we had been at 1.5%. So we had seen a 100% increase because of the Zooms and the GoToMeetings and WebExes and Asanas and Basecamps and Jiras and all the things that were helping with project management software. Those technologies had empowered this huge move. But there were two big impediments to the remote workforce. One was the mindset. We all know the manager that says, oh, I don't care what the studies say, because all the studies will tell us remote workers are happier, they're healthier.
In fact, we've had professors on this show saying exactly that, right?
Yeah. They're more engaged, they have higher retention rates. It's better for the company, it's better for the worker. Like there is no data to tell us otherwise.
And even the fear that you're less likely to get promoted because you're not getting FaceTime with your bosses, that's not true, right? They even found that promotion rates weren't affected.
And so we all know the person that said, yeah, I've read all the studies, but I think productivity equals presence. I think magic happens when people are in the office together. So I want everybody in the office.
We're hearing it from the banking bosses, right? Your old
100%
industry, right?
100%.
Get back in the office.
And the second impediment was policies, procedures, and infrastructure. It's one thing to say Jeff can work remotely. It's another to make sure that there is a remote option on every single meeting. Not, oh, Jeff's in this meeting, we need to add one. Because that's going to fall through the cracks. There are going to be meetings and be like, where is everybody? Like, I'm trying. And security and infrastructure, in as much as it's one thing, another thing to say that Jeff can work remotely. If Jeff can't access all the company's systems from outside the four walls, then I can't do anything. So you really aren't empowering me to work remote unless you have the policies that support it and you have the infrastructure to support it. And in March of 2020, the mindset had to change and the infrastructures and policies had to be put in place. And so we saw this huge shift. Now, the question becomes the snapback. To your point about banking bosses being like, we need people back in the office. There are some industries and some functions that are going to embrace this and move full forward. There are some industries and functions that are going to go, everyone get your butt back in the office. The productivity has been terrible because you can't paint with a broad brush. Even the studies that say all workers are better off. It's not every worker. It's not every function. It's not every industry.
That's right. I mean, the studies would say that creative work, new projects
100%
benefit from being in person.
And so we have this tech acceleration that occurred during the pandemic around digital work, around digital commerce, digital payments, digital currencies, blah, blah, blah. And people are using that data and starting to make predictions and not thinking about the snapback that's going to occur. God willing, it occurs soon where everyone goes, you know what? We're all vaccinated and we're declaring this over. And even before then, companies will start going back to the office en masse. We don't know what the snapback is going to look like, but we can start to look at what managers are saying they want, at what workers are saying they want. And what you generally see here in this survey data is you see very few workers, 5% ballpark, that say, I want to be back in the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5. But there are some, right? There are some workers that actually want that. And you also see very few workers that make the statement, I don't ever want to go to the office again. I want to be 100% remote. That's also 5%, maybe inching up towards 10. The middle 90% want a flexible work arrangement. They want to be in the office because we're social animals. We want to be around our colleagues. We want those serendipitous bump-ins. We want those creative sessions that you just can't do on a Zoom. But we also want the flexibility to be able to not go to the office for a week if we need to take a break, to do this or that. And so that is where the world of work will reside. But again, we got to remember, we're looking at that in the context of the 42% that can do this, the 58% that have to show up because they work at Disneyland. You can't be you can't be a ticket taker at Disneyland and work remotely. You
Right.
actually got to be at the park.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think that's it's an interesting stat because of the number of sort of leaders that I hear of who are starting to consider their property footprints and do we give up head offices and so on. Well, if it's only 8% of people who are going to work, that suddenly calls into question any major shifts in terms of property portfolio or whatever.
I will say the companies that I advise on this, the companies that I have the pleasure of just speaking with about this, there is this battle going on between de-densifying, where they have to allocate more square footage per employee because people don't want to be jammed up anymore, even though we will have beaten this virus. Scars are going to stay and they're not going to want to be, in bullpens together. So we're going to have to de-densify the offices, but we will have fewer people coming in and we're going to be able to hotel desk people. The general feeling or sentiment that I'm hearing is that all that math, again, broad brush here and very different industry function by function, is about a 10% reduction in office space.
Okay.
That's what it'll yield.
Right. So significant, but not,
Significant,
world-changing, but not radical, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Which is how things tend to go in the world of work. You see changes that are significant but not radical. And so people that make predictions that are so radical, okay, it's possible. It's just never happened before, but it's possible.
Right. Right. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about and taking your point that not all jobs are going to go on demand. In fact, perhaps much less than we think are going to go on demand. What do you see? Because I've got my own views on this, having read the book, but interested to hear you first. Like, what do you see as being like the great benefits of moving towards on demand, especially for people? This is a being human podcast, like for the people involved in that shift, versus the big risks from a human perspective.
So it's interesting. Every study that was done, McKinsey did one, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did one, and Upwork, MBO Partners, always would ask people, are you happy being on demand? And the answer was predominantly yes. 80% of people would not take a full-time job if offered. Now, all of these surveys were done in the 2010 to 2020 timeframe, right? A period of economic expansion and economic growth. I don't know what those people would have said over the last year. Would they have viewed more security in being with big company? So look, the number one benefits are the flexibility that people get in being in an on-demand capacity. That flexibility is more powerful as you move up the skill set chain. So, if you're an advanced search engineer or advanced technologist in almost any field, you can say when you want to work, how you want to work, and people will do it because your skills are so in demand. As you move down to kind of being a temp at an Amazon fulfillment center during the holidays, you don't have a lot of flexibility in that context. And both of those people are on-demand workers. So the flexibility that is offered is usually the number one reason that people enjoy it. The ability to work on different things and the creativity that engenders for them as opposed to being in one place. The ability to not have to deal with politics and corporate interactions and things like that. Positives. The negatives involve the security. And I always found it interesting that if I am a freelancer, and again, we're talking about a specific segment of the freelance market, not the entire on-demand market, but if I'm a freelancer and I'm very in demand, I have like 14 clients on average. That means I have 14 points of failure. Whereas if I'm a full-time employee, I have one client. I have one point of failure. If that client is unhappy, if that client gets in trouble, I can lose my entire income in one swoop. A freelancer very rarely, if almost ever, does lose all of their income. They may lose some of those clients. But the security is associated with a full-time job. Okay. The second big advantage is that, at least in the United States, the social safety net is entirely predicated on the W-2 and being a full-time employee. Unemployment insurance, workers' comp, you can't really get those as a on-demand worker, as a freelancer. And so the social safety net is so predicated. Healthcare is more difficult to get. A retirement plan is more difficult to administer and do as an independent worker. And those are very big impediments to the independent workforce. The same is true around any kind of insurance. And so for me to try to procure workers' comp on my own, super difficult, just super difficult, right? Can be done. There's a great company called 1099 Policy that's out there doing this now, but they've created the first program to do this. Otherwise, for me to be covered for a job place injury, I'd have to buy a ridiculous policy that as an individual I really can't afford. And so those are some of the drawbacks and impediments.
Right. But what's interesting as you say that is that you're coming back to that 80%. 80% are happier despite that, despite they don't have the insurance, despite they
Very
don't
true.
have this.
But that was also during a period of economic expansion.
Right.
When all of those things that were the downsides were not as present, because if you're making money, you can afford some of them anyway.
Right.
So I would be surprised as we see the new flock of surveys come out, because these are generally things that are done annually, if that 80% was true.
Right. But would you
Still.
expect it to have changed significantly, or would you still expect the majority of? Yeah.
I will expect it to have changed significantly for a period of time, because the pandemic, and I think we saw a lot of this in the pandemic, of data curves kind of having huge drops and then huge bounce backs. And so I would expect a big drop followed by a big bounce back.
Right. Yeah. But nonetheless, that's, it's still very interesting that, even in this period, whilst we were expanding, there was still certainly what you read in the press was a lot of the 0 hours contract, and a lot of demonization of firms employing on-demand workers. I think of, the Amazons and their sort of auction, for the parcel delivery prices, and and I suppose the Ubers and the and the other on-demand platforms, their participants striking or protesting.
And look, as with any new technology that comes on, and let's pick on Uber for a little bit. The Uber construct is this new technology that allowed all this new interaction, and shockingly, we didn't get it right at first. The way Uber went out with their business model, the way they're pricing, therefore the way they're compensating the people doing the work, which they view as independent contractors. In the UK, they just lost that case, and so now they have to be employees. In California, they thought they lost it, but then they were able to convince the people of California in an election to allow them to not lose it, because people were basically asked, do you want to wait 5 minutes longer for your ride and spend another $2 on your ride, and therefore the worker has benefits, or do you want the ride right now and do you not? And people said, no, screw those people. I want my Uber right now. We'll see how that plays out over time. The point being is that the new technology didn't jive with the social infrastructure, and therefore it had to adjust. And that, for those that study history, that's not a surprise. Not a surprise at all. We have to adjust to the new norm, and both parties have to find the right balance. And the balance is not, and there were studies in California saying the average Uber driver was making like $5 an hour after all their expenses. Not acceptable. Not acceptable for someone to be able to live on that wage rate, and a violation of obviously minimum wage laws, which as a freelancer don't apply. So we need to adjust business models. We need to adjust regulation, because one of the things you will certainly learn from history is that societies like stability. And if things get too out of whack with one entity, one class, one whatever, taking too much economic power, a reckoning will come. It will either come through higher taxes, or it will come through social disruption, or a host of other ways, but it will come. And society has to get back to some form of stability. I'm not saying equality and fairness, history wouldn't teach us that, but they would say if it gets too unequal, it will come back.
Right. Yeah, and that's sometimes, I think, well, certainly the narrative, not that I've got any data for this, but certainly the narrative seems to be that the on-demand work style is exacerbating the increase in inequality, right?
That is possible. I haven't seen any data to support that either. I think there's a lot of data around stagnant wages in the West, writ large. As with a lot of things in the world of labor, these are just supply and demand issues. You had 1 billion people enter the industrialized workforce, and therefore it was going to take time to balance out labor wage rates. They're not balanced yet, but they're getting closer, I should say, closer. And, so I'm not sure on demand is what's driving economic inequality. I think there are wage rate issues, and the stagnation of wages in the Western economies for the last 40 years has driven a lot of economic inequality.
Right. Yeah. Now, the other thing that you talk about, which I think is interesting, we get into this in your chapter 8, when you start to explore the effect of robots and automation and how that's going to mix with labor, and this concept which I hadn't come across before, but total talent management.
Oh, yes.
TTM. Right. Yeah, TTM, where firms are able to, I suppose, distribute work amongst humans and robots. I mean, part of it makes complete sense, and it seems, logical that that's the way we're heading. But I was sort of slightly alarmed to think that we're going to lump in like labor resource, even using that term, like resources, with robots, and like I'm going to sort of always bracket them all the same, and then just sort of juxtaposing that, where you write elsewhere in the book about this increasing value we're going to place on curiosity and creativity and the sort of human qualities. So, sort of, how do you square that?
Well, I think it's different industries and different functions working in different ways. And so, look, there are certain jobs that are going to require human creativity and empathy and things like that. And those jobs are growing, and those jobs are more difficult to slot into a total talent management construct, but not fully difficult, not impossible. What AI allows us to do is to see data patterns in things that we didn't seem to see data patterns in before. And it allows us to automate and create standardization and processes. And this is why in the book I try to make the argument around the first services revolution, because services are very difficult to find that repetitive high volume process. And it's that repetitive high volume process that generally gets automated. And so the idea of total talent management starts with, I need to understand what my people can do, because I know where, or at least I have an idea as to where the world's going and what skills are going to be needed, what as a company we're going to need in which geographies and which availabilities. But I don't know, through most human capital management software, I don't know what my people can actually do. A manager might know what his or her team can do, but as a company, I don't have that data flowing up. Now, you have it on your on-demand workforce, because if you're using a platform like WorkMarket, we will be here's your heat map of where all your skills are and how good somebody is. Are they a level 5, a level 4, or 3? And what their availability is. You get all that in your on-demand workforce. You don't get it in your full-time workforce. And human capital management softwares are changing. ADP is actually leading this, and I will give full credit to their new platform, Lifion. It is the most advanced piece of HCM software in the market, and it is looking down at the individual level, right? What can that individual do? And, WorkMarket has helped influence that roadmap, and WorkMarket is tied into Lifion. And so you get a chance to see your entire workforce, your full-time workers, part-time workers, your temps, your freelancers, and other aspects of things that can do work, like an AI system or a robot or a drone. And you get to understand, well, I have all of these things that could do the task that comes up. What is the most efficient labor resource to do that task? Most of the time, it is still a full-time employee. And we go deep into this in I believe it's chapter 6 equation. That labor equation will still tell us that it should be an employee for a very, very long time. Like there's not much that's going to change that unless there's a wholesale change in the regulatory structure or some massive leap forward that I, having studied this and spent a lot of time at the robotic facilities, that just isn't coming in the next 20 to 30 years. So outside of those changes, not much is going to change. We're going to, as we've done with labor markets before, we're going to slowly move forward. But a change that underpins this is this total talent management change, which is, how do I understand all of the skills inherent in my organization? And how do I marry those skills? How do I match those skills to all of the needs that I'm going to have to service my customers? And data allows us to do that in a way that we have not done before. And that's the promise of total talent management.
Right. And I mean, and that does make, it does make sense. It's almost as if as we continue to automate, different parts of how we work, right? We're going to end up with a greater variety of ways to solve complex problems and greater set of resources at hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so the software is going to need to adapt to cater to that, right? So, I think that makes complete sense. But the one reflection I had on this was the way that you painted the picture was very much in terms of sort of large scale platforms and firms interacting with, individuals and freelancers, right? And that basically being the dynamic. I just wondered, to what extent do you think the sort of the newer blockchain technologies, which are based more on a sort of peer-to-peer style of networking around a particular market need and more autonomy of individuals and even bots and so on such a network, do you see that having a significant role here?
Short answer is no, in as much as, actually, let me take it back. The right answer that I should have to that question is I haven't studied this enough to really have an opinion. Now, that said, here's my opinion. Look, I understand the basics of blockchain technology and I understand the distributed ledger, but I'm not sure that creates some sort of sea change in how the databasing structure within labor works. I appreciate all the different, so I don't see anything that says, wow, I'm going to manage my workforce differently if I manage it on the blockchain. And I've seen a lot of companies try to create, a blockchain version of Upwork or a blockchain version of Workday or ADP, and I've seen them get literally zero traction. I mean, zero. That's not to say in 5 years they may not be doing great and dominate, but right now I'm at a complete loss as to how it would fundamentally change the labor resource management process.
Yeah. And I suppose, as I reflect on what you said there, it probably only makes sense as long as there's almost a radical restructure of the economy, in a sense, to be away from firms sort of managing resources to, as I said, like nodes on a network coming to collaborate on particular projects and to solve particular sort of market needs. But
that is
a major restructure, right?
Yeah, look, that's a hallmark of the future of work in terms of the disaggregation of work into tasks and teams coming together, and that is that fluid team-based work from anywhere, always on job. But I'm not sure that, and I agree with you that it would have to be done outside of the firm structure in order for the blockchain to really become the organizing principle of labor resource management.
That's a good term, right?
But I don't see it. I don't see firms losing that kind of power because of all the benefits one has in organizing labor and resources and capital inside of a corporation.
Back to Coase, right? Back to where we started, right?
Back to our friend Professor Coase.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. The other thing I just wanted to pick on this because I just love it as an analogy. It doesn't really fit into the sort of the flow here, but I just thought I'd highlight it. Is given all of that, we've talked about data and data management and so on. What I just love this little anecdote that you bring up in chapter 10 around a fundraising call center at a university, where they gave, and their job was to raise money, right, for the university, and they gave 5-minute calls to people working in this call center with recipients of the scholarships. And as a result of that call and connecting the people in this call center with the impact they're having in the world, we saw a 400% increase in the number of calls that these operatives were making. And so it's like, in all of this, there's still room for this human connection and a sort of valuing the importance of human connection in all of this, right? That seemed to shine out as an example.
No question. Look, the example I like to point to is the ATM, which I talk a little bit about in the book. Look, the ATM wasn't disguising what it was trying to be. It's a machine that's automating the job of the teller. I mean, that's its name, automated teller machine. And yet, we still have bank tellers. Now, why? Why would we need a bank teller when I can do almost everything I need from that machine? Because in 1995, when the ATM appeared in every single bank branch, in the United States, there were 500,000 bank tellers. And what did everyone predict in 1995 about the bank teller job? Oh my God, in 10 years, there'll be 0 bank tellers. There are 600,000 bank tellers today.
Wow.
And a part of the equation when we actually do the work, because again, simple conclusions are almost always wrong. And the simple conclusion of, oh, ATM exists, therefore bank teller job goes, was dead wrong. What we did see is we saw a reduction from 21 to 13 of the average number of tellers per branch, because I no longer needed as many tellers in order to keep customers happy and keep it flowing. But we did see a huge increase in the number of bank branches because of normal economic growth and because of some deregulation that occurred in the banking industry in the United States. But people making these simple predictions didn't think about things like that. And you need to think about things like that if you're making predictions on labor. But the other thing, back to your point, is that I don't want to walk into the bank branch and only interact with a machine. Sometimes I do, but sometimes I want to go because I don't know what I'm doing and and I have a question and I want to make sure I'm doing it right. And I want to talk to that person. And that person sometimes will give me a lollipop and be like, oh, hey, thanks for coming into Chase. Thank you for your business. And if I walk into HSBC and they don't give me a lollipop and there is no person, then you know what? I'm going to take all my business to Chase, which is why, even though a technology exists, as a human, as a consumer, I want that interaction. The same can be said, by the way, for almost every single waiter and waitress in the world. The technology exists to completely remove that job. We do not need someone to come and tell us what's on the menu, tell us what the specials are. We don't need someone to make a recommendation. AI can do that. We don't want someone to tell us a wine pairing. The system can do that 100 times better than a waiter ever could or a waitress could. No disrespect to our sommelier friends, but I don't need somebody with that expertise. That's just data. And that's me saying, well, I'm in the mood for something that's like this. Boom, here are the things. Based on what you're eating, you should get one of these 3 wines. And yet, very few, if any, waiter or waitress jobs have been lost. Because as a human, I don't want the AI system. I want to hear what this person has to tell me about what's good tonight. I want to hear that. And I want to say, oh, what's that person having? Oh, they're having that. Oh, it's very interesting. And so the job doesn't go. Might it go over time? Sure, it might, but it just feels highly unlikely because as a human, I want that. And if I walk into a restaurant that's entirely automated, I'm probably not going to go back.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's an important, it's really important to hold on to, right? I think as a lot of people get fearful, don't they, about the future and the rise of AI and data-driven decision making and algorithms. But
and they like to make that statement of, oh, this new technology exists, therefore all, oh, inside warehouses now, there are robots that can move things around. So all warehouse jobs are going to go. Okay, maybe over time, but that's not how it actually works. And so if people take nothing else away from the book, I want them to take that point away that when somebody says, oh, this tech exists, all that's going to go, okay, well, maybe. Let's walk through how things actually work in that industry, what the competitive environment is, what the technologies can do, what the technology deployment looks like, because just because a technology exists doesn't mean companies buy it all at once. They slowly deploy things over time. What the cobot scenario is, where the human works with the robot, what the customer service aspect is. And now let's think about that function in that industry and start making some predictions about when or if jobs may go.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and you having built a company in this sector, having spent, as you said, 7 years, right, got a book, should give people some comfort that we don't need to jump to the doomsday immediately, right?
Not just yet. Not just yet. In the long term, all bets are off.
Right.
But the next 20 years, I think we can be highly confident, not 100%, but highly confident in how the labor market will probably unfold.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, as you're starting to think and scouting around what your next punt might be, what sort of tickling your fancy in terms of trends and areas that you think might be, without asking you to give too much away, might be ripe for, a startup?
I think there's a lot to be done around former employees of companies. It surprises me how few companies run alumni networks. And the companies that do it incredibly well and see a huge benefit from it. But most companies don't do it. And I think that is a failing, and I think I know how to solve it. And so I'm gonna potentially move forward on that, but that's one of 3 different ideas kind of fighting for mind space right now as I think through. But look, that process of thinking through what's the problem that we're going to address, how big of a problem is it, and then what is our potential solution, that is something that as a startup founder, I think through a lot in that framework. And certainly as an advisor or investor in startups, I push companies to think. I was on the phone yesterday with a company that is creating a marketplace of doulas and lactation experts. And I said to them, I'm like,
Lactation. Oh, as in doula,
yeah,
right? I was thinking
doulas,
swords
like,
fight. I was trying to add those 2 things. Doula, as in somebody with a sword fighting somebody on a horse.
no.
And lactation expert. I could make those 2
I
work.
mean, you could probably get those 2 together, be a hell of a party. But they want to, in the prenatal and postpartum world, provide the services, because that entirely happens right now via recommendation. It's just you ask your friends who they've used. And if they don't have anybody, you scramble and you're in trouble. And you know what? That's actually pretty good. It's a pretty good idea. Like, that will happen. There will be a marketplace where we'll go and do that. Now, will they be a niche marketplace or will it be a part of a larger marketplace? Who knows? The point being, as I said to these founders, what problem are you trying to solve? And they went on for about 5 minutes. I'm like, no, give me the one sentence of what is the problem and try to incorporate some data in that. Like 78% of women or 70% of families are unable to provide, to get the prenatal and postpartum services they need, costing $7 billion. Okay, that's a problem. How do you solve it? And so those are things I think about a lot in terms of HR tech, which is certainly the area I will stay in, and play with some ideas.
Wow. Well, I wish you luck. I'm sure you'll be successful. What's your run rate? What's your sort of strike rate so far of the startups you founded? How many have succeeded?
Well, there were technically 4. First one failed miserably and basically bankrupted me. And so,
Oh, wow.
if you're going to do 4 and you're going to have one of them wipe you out, have it be the first. That's my other big lesson, other big takeaway. The second one was a reincarnation of the first, and we built it and eventually got sold to Salesforce, and it was a good outcome. The third was just an app I built, and we ended up selling it to a TV show, and so it was okay. And then the fourth was WorkMarket. And so technically I'm at 75%. So we'll see if we can increase our average to 80% with the fifth and probably last.
Right. That's good. Nearly bankrupted you. So
yeah.
Interesting. How do you we talk about resilience a lot right now, especially in these days. What is there anything you can share in terms of how you came back from that? Like,
well, I'll say this. As a founder, you think everything's on you because in a lot of ways it is. The company will succeed or fail because of your efforts. You have to put the company on your back at multiple points and just push forward. And one of my favorite quotes in startup world is the key to success is you get knocked down 7 times and you get up 8. And there's something about it that I love because it's just very evocative, right? You could see the person getting knocked down, having to stand up and dust themselves off and keep going. And there's something so wonderful about the numbers, and as much as you will get knocked down again and again and again. And when you think about the equation of, is this company going to be successful? There are a lot of variables in that equation. Some of them are dependent, some of them are independent, some of them are unknown. But the largest variable in that equation is you. And so the other reason, by the way, I love that quote is it's mathematically incorrect. If I got knocked down 7 times, I would get up 7 times. And it's on t-shirts, get knocked down 7 times, get up 8. I'm like, no, you get knocked down 7, you get up 7. But be that as it may, leaving that aside for a second, the thing is that, there's this whole ethos, there's this whole narrative of it's on you and you've got to make it work. And it kind of leaves out that there are so many people willing to help you. If you picked up the radio, called for help.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't think about that enough in the startup that failed, that there were people willing to help me. And when it went down, all I did was ruminate on the things that I screwed up and how I messed this up. And I let down my investors, I let down my team. And as I was wallowing in that depression, I still wasn't picking up the radio and asking for help. I just was beating myself up, not leaving my apartment, not getting out of bed some days. you're really down in the dumps. And eventually, if there are all these circles of people that could help you if you ask, there are
Right.
investors and advisors, and then there are your team, and then there's your friends, and then there's your close friends, and then eventually there's your family. And so it was my family, it was my older brother that kind of
Oh,
basically kicked
great.
down the door. He's like, "What are you doing? Get it together." He's like, "Why? What's so different about your life right now?" "Oh, I lost all my money," and he's like, "Shake it off." I mean,
Right.
he was a little bit more compassionate than that. And he's the one that put out his hand and picked me up. And I stood
That's a
up, dusted myself off, and said, "All right, we got to keep going."
that's a
But
beautiful
I
story.
don't pretend it's easy.
No. And is your brother in the does he got a similar risk appetite, or is
Well, he is a wellness professional. He's a yoga teacher, and he and
okay?
his wife actually have a business that provide corporations with wellness services, and they do
Mm,
very well with it. And they actually work with some of the most renowned companies in the world. Uh, so he is in theory an entrepreneur as well,
right.
but in a very different context.
Right. Right. Well, that's great. So call on your brother, or at
If
least
if
let your
all else
brother in.
fails,
Yeah.
if all else fails, but the thing is that if I had reached out, many other people would have put their hands out to help,
Mm,
and you just don't reach out. And so you got to pick up that radio. Like, there is no officer in the NYPD or any other police force anywhere in the world that doesn't hesitate for a second to pick up that radio and ask for help. No
yeah.
officer's like, "Oh, I'm not asking for help. I'm going to take these people down by myself." No, there's not a single officer anywhere that does that. They radio into Central and they say, "Here's the situation. I need backup." And there is
Yeah.
no reason that anybody should think that they are braver than these men and women that are out there defending, us every single day and keeping us safe. So don't
Yeah.
try to be braver than them. Pick up your radio and call for help.
I love that, because there must be, many people right now, maybe they're isolating, they're cut off from their families, feeling it right now. Well, we know from
No
some of the
question.
talking about data, right? We know
Yeah.
that loneliness has gone up in certain segments of society. So great advice. All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll flash the book up once more. End of Jobs. Very easy to read and full of data. Some wonderful anecdotes as well. And then, of course, you've got a bunch of essays which you didn't really touch into at the end of the book. Or maybe we should just touch on that and the prize
Happy to
that
touch
you've
on that.
got related to
Sure.
that.
Well, I'll say this. Writing a book sucks. It just sucks. Like, it is not fun. The number of times that I would be reading through what I wrote, in a big printout, and I just throw it in the air and storm out of the office and turn to my secretary and be like, "I'll clean it up. Don't worry about it. I'll be back tomorrow." I was just so angry because I hated it. Hated writing. Very happy with what I produced, but I hated the process. And my publisher called me up a couple of years ago, so maybe a year before the book finally came out, and was like, "You don't have enough. Like, this is too short. You need more. You need to do more research." And I was like, "No, like, I've said everything I'm going to say. Like, this is the book." And a friend of mine actually came up with the idea of, "You know what? You've interviewed hundreds of people, the people actually shaping the future of work. Why don't you ask them what they think the world looks like in 2040?" I was like, "Oh my God, that's brilliant. That's awesome. I'm totally going to do that. I'm going to Tom Sawyer this. I'm going to get them to paint the fence." And so I reached out to a bunch of them. And surprisingly, almost everybody I reached out to said yes, that they would contribute 4 or 5 pages on what they think the world of work looks like in 2040. Many of them couldn't do it once they finally asked their company's approval because they had to sign a legal agreement with me and the publisher. Many people tried to do it and then wrote an email being like, "Dude, sorry, I can't get this done." So good luck. But we did receive a number of submissions, and we culled it down to the best 20. Because, look, I have my framework: history, data, how companies actually engage labor. I use that. I make predictions. I like my framework. I can defend everything I predict, but I don't pretend it's the only way to do it. And I certainly know that these people that wrote are much smarter than me when it comes to these things, and probably in many other ways. And so we came to the idea, I have the great pleasure of serving as an advisor to the X Prize, and I'm a huge, huge fan of what they do. And so I thought to myself, you know what? I'll make this like an X Prize challenge. And I looked for sponsors and I couldn't find anybody, so I had to personally do it. And as a member of the leadership team at ADP at the time, ADP, because I was still a member of ADP when the book came out, ADP made me actually physically take the money, put it into a separate account so that the prize is funded. They were concerned that I wouldn't actually give the money away. But there's now an account sitting with the money that under any reasonable scenario will grow to the $10 million prize in 2040. And in 2040, each of the authors gets a vote. They can't vote for their own piece. God willing, they'll all still be with us, myself included, because certainly I get to vote. And whoever is the most correct in their prediction is going to win the $10 million prize. And so, like I will tell you, chapter 10, which incorporates all their essays, is by far my favorite chapter.
Yeah.
It's not just because I didn't have to write it, which is very high on the list of why I like it, but it's just amazing. I mean, these are heads of the largest staffing firms, heads of the largest labor union, heads of trade associations, largest investors in this space, the CHROs of some of the world's largest companies. And they are amazing in what they predict. And they're all over the place, by the way. We have some people that have a very utopian view of the world in 2040.
It's such diversity of thought, right?
Some people have a very dystopian view of the world in 2040. And one of the smartest people I know in the space, who is one of the leading attorneys in the space, William Hayes Weissman at Littler, I'm going to be a bit reductionist here, basically says, it's all the same. Not that much is different, which is obviously not really what he says, but that's the way I kind of view his piece, is the middle of the road piece.
Right. Well, it'd be interesting to see. What if this podcast is going back? It's still going in 2040. Maybe get you on and see who's won.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jeff. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Such a pleasure.
Yeah. I hope some people got it out there. We got tips on building startups and recovering from failing ones, as well as the future work. So it's great. All right. Thanks. We'll put notes. We'll put links to the book. Is there anything else you want to point people to?
I actually, just after 20 years of owning the website jeffwald.com, I finally put content up on it. And so you can buy the book directly on Amazon, or you can come to jeffwald.com. It just brings you right to Amazon. It's no difference. Okay. But you can also see some of the other articles I've written and speeches I've given.
Excellent. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.